Okay, so now let's talk about mesh distance fields. Mesh distance fields are a concept of generating um, data information like the best way to put it is it's taking all the static mesh information that's used in the level and it's propagating a kind of proxy version of your meshes to create different aspects of ambient occlusion, shadowing, or even ways to help with masking off certain assets. Primarily, it became a big function with the application of Fortnite. It allowed them to create levels that didn't have issues with lighting, considering the fact that, like, let me hop into this distance field shadowing. They have these huge, like 8 kilometer by 8 kilometer levels. It's a lot to render and deal with. So in these like very sparsed out lands or levels that they're working on, it's really hard to propagate information. Um, what it will automatically do is it actually will sample ambient occlusion based off of what your current level is and how your settings are within distance fields. Here's an example of, like, what it is with normal sampling, and then this it is with actual depth distance field applications of it. You can even do it better with large landscapes and foliage, like these giant, like these trees that are off in the distance. Um, Naturally speaking, trees kind of have a little bit of ambient occlusion that's works with like the normal screen space stuff. But what this does is it provides more of a deeper depth and creates distance based ambient occlusion so that your trees don't look so fake and far off. Because when you start looking at assets further off, you're not going to get as much information. Even here, like in this is in one of the Fortnite levels, you can see that like here in this version, there's no ambient occlusion based inside the level or inside these buildings. There's no light source or anything. So why should they have this much amount of information versus here outside that has more bounce information? So here with it applied, you can actually see that the areas are actually darker on the inside and that you actually have this more darker crease along because that's naturally what happens with ambient occlusion. There are other uses of it. There's also soft shadowing. So like here with the use of the distance fields based soft shadowing, you actually get more accurate representations of um, soft adjustments and diffuse light. So like here in Fortnite, they have to they most likely have it's dynamic in a lot of cases because these assets are destructible. You can destroy a majority of these assets and the lighting will adjust to it. You won't see floating shadows. So one way they can help approximate shadows better without needing to deal with to make it look good without it needing to have a lot of performance to take care of these types of shadows is using this screen space adjustments. Even here with this distance, this is what I was talking about where when you're looking far off on trees and other assets, sometimes they have this where because you're further off in the distance, it's not going to calculate information because performance wise, you're not close to any of these trees. The engine basically is like, I'm going to LOD out this tree, but also I'm not going to calculate the information close like that far off. When you do shadow map distancing, which works with distance field information, it will apply a simple version of shadowing to it just to give you a bit of depth as well as to refine the shadows a bit better. So what we're going to do now is let's hop into the scene. And the first way to apply distance fields is up here in the settings in your project settings. If you go up here into the search details, you can type in distance. And right down here in the engine rendering section, you can turn it on here. It will require you to restart. For folks who have a tend to have issues with performance when clicking on settings like this, be very wary that you will have to recalculate some shaders as well as it will now start to generate mesh distance fields. So if you're turning this on for the first time in a project that has a lot of assets, you might have to take some time to let it run. You can do things like turning on 8-bit compression. So naturally speaking, the distance fields take on a 16-bit form of interpolation for gradation. If you want to, you can try and make it a little bit smaller with performance. But if you have large assets that use mesh distance fields, you're gonna have artifacts. Same thing here. If you want to compress some of the settings as well, you will also get issues with artifacting. But if that's one way you want to handle performance better, by all means. So click those on, be very aware to restart, and then you'll see something in the bottom that says like generating mesh distance fields or distance fields. You can actually go and after it's turned on, you can go into the show settings and go to visualize, and you can actually now turn on and look at distance fields. So what this is it's an approximation of the level, and it finds areas where like the assets are intersecting or assets that have a clear like mask or an edge. It masks out those spots for you. It's trying to approximate like a very simple and rudimentary version of the level that it can use this information to create certain effects, like for ambient occlusion or shadows or even masking between certain objects. And the cool thing is that again, it's real time, so you can adjust this and you rebake. It will recalculate that information with the bake. So now let's apply. It might take a little bit of time. But now what it's doing is it's understanding that there's more underneath this level, but it's still making that mask available at this certain distance. And you can also do other things like in each asset, there are settings you can adjust for distance fields. You can set it up to be um, here in some of the basic build settings, you can turn on two-sided distance field generation, which is very good for like foliage or small assets that do use two-sided. I would not recommend using it for assets like this, where it's a whole non-hold box in a sense. You might run into an issue where it starts creating these weird shadow artifacts from the inside because it thinks that it's another mesh on the inside. So try not to do that for every asset. You can even go in and make some adjustments like you can apply proxy meshes to help with distance fielding. Maybe this mesh is kind of creating a weird look with its distance fielding. You can go in and create a more simple version and then work with that for distance fields. Or you can even do this where you can adjust your scale resolution. It'll take a little bit of time, but what it's going to do is it's going to create a better and more accurate version of your mesh with your distance fields. So we had that weird artifacting thing that happened on the top. If we actually go back and hit save, you'll see that we have a more defined mesh now, that there aren't any artifacts and stuff. You can do the same thing in a lot of these places. Like these guys are simple geos, so you can't really do something like that. But for assets that are really complicated, like certain buildings or even like hard surface, like greeble stuff, you would probably do something like that to help with better approximations. And it's not just this. You can even go in, just make sure to turn this off first, and then hop in and you can visualize the ambient occlusion too. It approximates the ambient occlusion as well. Naturally speaking, it will apply, but then it also applies a bit of distancing. So sometimes you might get this weird little artifact because it's like it's trying to define your mesh, but in a lot of cases it might not actually show up. You just have to be very aware of how the distance fields are applied and stuff. Also, another small thing to deal with is naturally speaking, these types of assets, you might get a little bit of ambient occlusion on here, but in most cases, distance fields don't apply to skeletal meshes because they're dynamic assets. So be very aware of how you're handling things. See here, there's no distance fields because it's a skeletal mesh. You can see here, like on the sphere, everything else, there is application to it. And that essentially is some basics of mesh distance fields. I'm going to go over in our next lesson how to use distance fields in a different kind of way within your shader, um, more or less pertaining with a water shader.